Welcome to Sew with Monty. Today I want to show you top stitching. We're going to do an edge stitch and a 1/4 inch top stitching and explain to you its purposes. So the first thing I have done, I've cut 3 by 6 inch rectangles, the grain line running parallel to the 6 inch edge, and I'm going to sew 2 5/8 inch seams, one here and one here, right sides together. And then I want to bring them back over here and show you how to grade the seam and press it so that we can do a very effective top stitch and edge stitch. So the first thing I've done is stitch 2 5/8 inch seam allowances on my fabric, and I put right sides together, and I put 2 pieces together 3 by 6, and then I've taken the other side of the center 3 by 6 and sewn the third piece onto it. So now they're all in one continuous piece, 1 2 3 3 by 6s. I haven't pressed anything yet, but I want to show you how to grade these seams. Now this whole exercise is very good for beginners, just to practice and learn how to control your fabric and use these different stitches. It's also good for seasoned sewists who are testing a fabric before you're making something to make sure that the weight of it is going to be effective, how big to make your stitching for your top stitching, etc. So this is a good exercise for both beginners and seasoned sewists. The first thing I'm going to do is grade the seams. So I want to take this seam right here, and I'm going to cut one edge of the seam allowance half the size of the other one. So I'm going to trim off approximately 1/4, a little bit more than 1/4 off this side right here. And that way, when I turn it to do my edge stitching, I won't have a thick, blunt edge showing through the impression of my fabric when I press. So the first way of grading this seam is we're just going to take our scissors and peel back one seam allowance, right like this, and then I'm going to trim it off. So I'm just going to go in here and trim off half of it with my scissors, making sure I keep the other side folded back out of the way so that I don't catch it with my scissors and cut through both edges. This is a very simple way of grading. And now you see that my seam allowance is higher on one and shorter on the other. This way, when you press your seam over, you're not going to have a big ridge there making an impression on your outside fabric. Now the other way of grading is to use the rotary cutter. So now I have my ruler in place to use my rotary cutter, and I've got my seam allowance open underneath the ruler. So one side of my seam allowance is this way, one's the other. This allows me to cut just a single edge of my seam allowance, not both pieces. This is most effective when you have long straight runs, like the leg of a pant, or something where you're cutting long areas and you need to have more control. So you just want to take your rotary cutter and align it with your ruler and press firmly and cut off what you don't want along the edge of your seam allowance. Always check before I lift this up to make sure that I've made a full cut before I pull my ruler up. So that's it. That's how to grade a seam using your rotary cutter. So as you can see, both seams are graded. Let me pull it up a little bit. Both seams are graded like this. Now what we're going to do, we're going to turn this over, and on one seam we're going to do a 1/8 inch or between 1/8 and a 1/16 inch edge stitch. And the other one, we're going to take it and press it so that we've got this fold along the seam itself and do a 1/4 inch top stitch along a clean edge here. So let's go ahead and do the sewing. So now I have my seams pressed. You want to make sure when you're doing the edge stitch, let's talk about that one first, that you take the fuller seam allowance and cover the shorter seam allowance so that it protects it. Then you're going to run your stitch just alongside of the edge of the seam on the seam allowance side. That way it secures and holds everything down. So let's do this one first. And I'm just going to start at the top. When I'm sewing, I like to come in just a little bit from the top, a little bit from the edge. I'm aligning my foot up with the inside groove of my foot with the seam, foot and seam, inside groove. And I'm going to use a little bit bigger stitch because this is a decorative stitch or a stabilizer stitch, and we'll talk about that just in a moment. So I'm going to go up to 3.5. Now this is optional. You may want to stick with a 2.5 or 2.5 to 3, maybe even go up to 4. It's just depending on what you're doing. But doing a sample is how you find that out, what you want to do. So we're just going to start off with a few short stitches, and then I'm going to back up a little bit. And I'm just using a stitch very close to the edge of my seam. And I'm using the inside edge of my foot right here with the seam to do this sewing. And I'm not looking at anything else. Following your needle is not going to help you. Always look at what you line your seam up to and stay there visually so that you do the right thing. And when you come to the end, just slow down, back up a few stitches just to keep it in place. Now, what this edge stitch is good for, other than decorative, which it is beautiful as a decorative stitch, as you can see, but it also is a stabilizer. It reinforces seams to make them stronger and more stable. The third thing it can be is used as an understitch. So if you want to have a facing and you want it to stay down and not roll up and see the seam, if you use the edge stitch as an understitch on your facing side of your garment, it's going to make the seam roll under and you're not going to see it from the outside. See how nice that looks? So if I press this, it's going to stay under there and not show. Now, the second stitch we're going to do is a 1/4 inch top stitch, and we're going to do this one a little differently. What I've done here is I've pressed my seam. I actually pressed it over this way, but it doesn't matter this time because we're going to sandwich the seam allowance in between, making sure that the fold is right on the top edge of my fabric. Now, to press this, you want to press it once on the inside, once on the outside to make sure you don't have a tuck in here, and then press the third one in half like this. Now this time I want to do a 1/4 inch top stitch, so I'm going to line it up with my 1/4 inch line in the back of my machine. And sometimes this is a little hard to see, so you have to kind of look over and find it. And once you have that figured out, now this just so happens to be a 1/4 inch aligns me up with the fold with the inside of my foot again, as long as my needle's in the left hand position on my machine. So you have to kind of see where that is. I do recommend, if you have trouble finding these lines, put a little masking tape on your grid, on your needle plate, and that way you can see where your seam allowance actually has to be. So we're going to go first just a little bit forward. I'm about 1/8 of an inch from the edge of my fabric. I don't like to start right on the edge. That's how you end up with a mess. And then we're going to go straight through, aligning the fold of the fabric up with the inside edge of my foot, because I've determined that gives me a 1/4 inch top stitch. Now, if you're doing this for a test sample, this would be a good way to see if the fabric is going to stretch when you're sewing this. Is it going to pucker? What kind of stitch length it looks appropriate on your fabric. If you're working with a wool flannel or something, you might want a little longer stitch length. But you can see that it's very effective in controlling your stitch, in controlling the edge of your fabric for stability and also for decorative purposes.